newsagents.
In 2019, the Conservatives stood on a manifesto that was very much centre ground. But under Rishi Sunak, they've abandoned the centre ground and broken many election promises. Meanwhile, under Keir Starmer, Labour have changed. And I think that change is going to bring a much better future for our country. And that's why I'm so keen to join the Labour Party and play my part in bringing that important future forward.
That is not just any new member of the Labour Party. That is, until yesterday, the Conservative MP for Dover. On the front line of the battle against the small boats, Natalie Elphicke has crossed the floor. She's defected from the Conservative Party and joined Keir Starmer's growing army.
Is this a hurrah moment for Labour? Well, wait till you hear a little bit more about Natalie Elphicke, about how after her husband was convicted of sexual abuse, she said he'd been punished for being charming, wealthy, charismatic and successful. Wait till you hear her comments about that Marcus Rashford missed penalty in the Euro finals. Wait till you hear her views on P&O sacking 800 workers. Is she a blessing for Labour or is she a curse? Welcome to the Newsagents.
It's John.
It's Emily.
And I've got to describe our day in Newsagents HQ because we all listen to Prime Minister's questions avidly.
Yes.
Emily is kind of got some recording device, which means she's on a 2-minute delay.
No, it's the computer. I put my earphones in so I don't have to listen to
Don't
all
make
of you go,
excuses.
whoa, whoa.
So she's on a 2-minute delay and we've gone, holy shit, there's another frigging defection to the Labour Party.
And I say, no spoilers, no spoilers.
And then eventually Maitlis catches up.
Anyway, it was quite a moment because you suddenly realised after the first question and Rishi Sunak had done his welcome this and welcome that Keir Starmer gets to his feet and signals to the place behind him, which we now know is the place where each week there seems to be defector City Central. Last week, it was Dan Poulter, who had defected as a doctor in the NHS to join the Labour Party. In the middle of the week, we had a new MP, Blackpool South, after that astonishing by-election win on Thursday. And today, suddenly, you could see the Conservatives craning their necks, pointing as the penny dropped that Natalie Elphicke, Brexiteer, Tory, defender of her husband's conviction for sexual assault. We'll come on to that in a moment. But it was a proper what the moment.
I think we say WTF. I don't think we need to actually spell out the... But so anyway, look, we're going to play Natalie Elphicke in a moment, but this is Keir Starmer's opening salvo at Prime Minister's questions.
I also warmly welcome the new Labour MP for Dover to these benches. Mr. Speaker, if 1 week a Tory MP who's also a doctor says the Prime Minister can't be trusted with the NHS and joins Labour, and the next week the Tory MP for Dover, on the front line of the small boats crisis, says the Prime Minister cannot be trusted with our borders and joins Labour, what is the point of this failed government staggering on?
So that was Keir Starmer kind of glowing, his latest recruit. And just after PMQs, Natalie Elphicke answered a couple of questions from reporters.
You said that Labour's policy was open borders, pro-immigration. It doesn't want to stop the boats. Labour cannot be trusted on immigration. Have you changed your mind on that? And just again, have Labour offered you a peerage?
So under Rishi Sunak, he is the man who said he would stop the boats. And yet when we look at this year alone, it's record numbers of small boats arrivals. So he's not stopping the boats and he's letting the country down. Well, meanwhile, under Labour, they are clear that it is important to have defence and they want to make sure that they have good national security. So I think we should have confidence that Labour are the party who will tackle this issue of the small boats.
So just finally, then, have Labour offered you a peerage?
No. What I've said that I will do and what I've been asked to do is to contribute in the area of housing, which has been a long-standing area of experience for me. And it's absolutely vital that we build the homes the country needs, because under Rishi Sunak, we've seen house building simply collapse in this last year. And going forward, it looks like it will be another missed manifesto promise from the Conservatives, not 300,000 homes, but probably half of that number. So I'm really pleased to be able to join the Labour Party. The Labour has changed and it will will be building the homes that our country needs.
OK, so there are ideological questions which we'll come on to. There's also the very practical questions of what that defection means. And there was a flurry of sort of little whispers, and all of us trying to go, is she the Labour choice? Is she sitting in the same seat? Is what happens now? They've got an established selected Labour candidate called Mike Tapp, who's, to all intents and purposes, the person that they want. So we started ringing around and trying to find out what was going on. And it turns out that Natalie Elphicke, who, we should just say, according to recent polls of that seat, Dover, has a 17% chance of winning for the Conservatives. I'm sure that didn't influence her thinking at all, but it's just useful to have in the back of your mind, will not become the MP.
The prospective parliamentary candidate.
She will not become the candidate. She's actually stepping down. And her seat itself will change because of boundaries. And that was why you were hearing the question about, have you been offered a place in the Lords? What is Labour getting from this? And what is she getting from Labour? And I guess that is almost the bigger question. She doesn't want to stand again. She's not going into the Lords, according to that. Is she trying to punish Rishi Sunak? Is she trying to not lose? Why isn't she just stepping down, I guess? What does she get from this?
If you want to kick your Prime Minister and you want to try and get yourself on the right side of history, as some of these people do, and you go where the wind blows, and she describes herself in her statement as a centrist MP who has always believed that, that's where the Conservative Party should be. She feels it's being dragged to the right. She feels it no longer represents her interests. That is all, frankly, manna from heaven for Keir Starmer, because it underlines that the Conservative Party is going in a rightward direction and the centre ground is being held by Starmer, and he's now attracting Tories to it. If you're Starmer, you're thinking, happy days, this is glorious in itself. In the headlines that it gives him today, that off the back of the local council election results, horrendous as they were, you have got another Tory MP defecting to you. That in itself is fabulous for the short-term political gain. But Natalie Elphicke, in a way that Dan Poulter wasn't, is a much more complicated figure for the reasons, Emily, you set out in our introduction when you were talking about some of the backstory about her support for her husband, a convicted sex offender, and also for the fact that, how was it she won that seat in Dover?
Yeah, let us, instead of sort of skipping over this, let's just get to the bottom. And we're not trying to define a wife by her husband, but I think in this situation, her response is quite telling, because Charlie Elphicke was the former MP in that seat in Dover. And the Sunday Times broke the story that a woman had come forward and said she'd been raped by a former Prime Minister. And he then tried to sue the paper, the Sunday Times, for libel. But just a few years on, this was back in 2017, a few years on, he was jailed for sex offences. He dropped the case of libel. And she then managed to stand in his seat for the 2019 election under Boris Johnson, the Get Brexit Done one, and she then won it. And her response to his conviction was, I'm going to say, nothing short of extraordinary, because immediately she announced the end of their marriage on Twitter. Then she performed a U-turn, announced her support for him once again. And then in this interview, she defended Charlie Elphicke and said that he'd basically been an easy target for dirty politics and false allegations because he was wealthy and handsome. And she dismissed the claims of Elphicke's accusers. So there will be a lot of women, I suspect, watching this now. There may even be victims themselves watching this thinking, what on earth is the Labour Party doing? Embracing this woman into their fold. This is the Labour Party who have, to all intents and purposes, kicked out Diane Abbott on one wing of the party, sort of marginalised other MPs for what they've, said and done in sort of statements previously that have been left hanging, but seem to be welcoming in Natalie Elphicke. I'll give you another example of what she said. She used a debate in 2022 when P&O had sacked, the ferry company. They'd sacked 800 workers and they'd replaced them with cheaper foreign workers. And she then uses it, I think we can play this to you now, as an opportunity then to attack trade unions.
Finally, I'd like to take a moment to address the dangers of militant unionism. I have worked closely with the RMT union on the previous restructure of P&O. I have always found the union to be firm and constructive in the workers' interests, as am I. In light of that close working in the interests of my constituents, I was invited by RMT leaders to join a march in support of Dover's P&O workers on Friday, which I did, along with the Conservative leader of Dover District Council and Conservative councillors, because we are united in getting those jobs back and doing right by the P&O workers affected. However, I found myself surrounded, bullied and abused by hard left militants. It was clear that they were unelected bully boys seeking to drown out the voice of democratically elected representatives, me as the representative for Dover. It is the hallmark of the bad old days of the 1970s and 80s, and we must guard against that returning. I will not be intimidated from serving my community by odious, hard-left militants who thrive on division, nor will I be deflected from serving my community and my duty to represent the ferry workers. That's why we must all call out the behaviour of hard-left militants.
Oh, okay. She's going to get along well with Mick Lynch, isn't she?
OK, fine. You want to set yourself up as a Tory MP against odious hard-left militants, as she describes them there. She also has gone after other targets as well. And one in particular, Marcus Rashford, after he missed the penalty in the Euro finals against Italy, said that he should spend more time perfecting his game rather than playing politics. When she said Rashford was playing politics, I think he had a campaign for getting free school meals for kids
was literally
from
looking
underprivileged
after kids,
backgrounds.
yeah, giving them hot meals at lunchtime.
And that was his playing politics. She would subsequently apologise for those comments. But, I mean, Rachel Reeves, who was our guest on this podcast yesterday, did a show with another podcaster, Matt Ford. And when Rachel Reeves was told about those comments by Natalie Elphicke, she came over all Marjorie Taylor Greene.
The MP for Dover, Natalie Elphicke, when Rashford missed a penalty, her tweet was, if we spent more time on football rather than trying to get free school meals for our kids, maybe it'd be better. Fuck off.
So I imagine that the Tories are going to spend
the sisterhood in the Labour benches is going to be great with Natalie Elphicke and Rachel Reeves together.
Do you know what? I mean, sorry, it's not really about the sisterhood. It's about finding a church so broad that you actually can't see one end of it from the other. I mean, Sam Friedman has summed it up beautifully. He said a party that includes Zara Sultana and Natalie Elphicke is a church so broad it's offering bar mitzvahs. I mean, there is something, there is something just deeply unsettling about Labour not minding about any of its principles to the extent that that is fine now.
So I would imagine there'll be a lot of Labour activists who will feel deeply, deeply uncomfortable about the idea that Natalie Elphicke, MP brackets Labour, is now sitting on their benches. Someone with such a backstory that is so complicated. Against that, you have the kind of upside of this is going to be another day of absolutely shit publicity for the Conservative Party, another Tory defect, and cites the abandonment of the centre ground as her reason for leaving the Conservative Party, which does a lot of lifting for Labour in terms of its positioning at the election, about how Labour has changed, how it's no longer a party of the left.
But she was never really of the centre ground. I mean, that's what's so extraordinary. The person who I'm actually feeling quite sorry for now is Dan Poulter, because Dan Poulter, I think, does fit the Labour mould to some extent. You know, has worked in the NHS, did feel deeply uncomfortable about his party's approach and the way it was coming to issues like NHS waiting lists and its priorities. And I think if you'd done that 2 weeks ago, you risk now being sort of put in this same sort of kettle of Natalie Elphicke and whoever comes next as slightly disenfranchised, don't know what to do, join the Labour Party. Now, Dan Poulter's not standing at the next election. Natalie Elphicke, we know, is not standing at the next election. Curiously, Labour is being quite clever at some of the people it's brought in. Last night on Channel 4, Marina Wheeler did her first TV
Boris
interview.
Johnson's ex-wife.
Well, let's call her an extraordinary talented lawyer in her own right, an advocate, and she's been working on sort of children's issues very forcefully. But of course, she is also Boris Johnson's ex-wife, so a real scalp in Labour terms in terms of bringing her into the fold. Does Labour just sort of want to do this big tent thing? Which is, we think you've all got a role, right?
Yes, it does want to have a big tent. The danger is having someone inside the tent who isn't necessarily pissing out of the tent, but maybe pissing all over the tent.
Yeah.
And I think that the loose cannon element of Natalie Elphicke should be a concern.
There's cannons and piss now. This is
mixing my metaphors too much.
Yeah.
Okay. Forget the cannons, but who is kind of someone who, can be a little unguided.
Yeah.
Let's put it like that. And given some of the things she has said in the past, I would imagine the Labour Chief Whip will be thinking, OK, great, but can we just make sure that she doesn't start doing things that actually start to harm us, as well as giving us a huge publicity lift?
He doesn't have a role to play because she's not going to be an MP. So
in 6 months' time. But for the next 6 months, she's still the MP for
see what you
Dover.
mean.
So there's still the potential. I'm not saying anything bad will happen, but the question you raised in the introduction, blessing or curse, we just don't know yet.
I think we probably do.
Yeah, and in a moment we're going to talk about AstroZeneca and vaccines and why they have withdrawn their vaccine from the market.
We're going to talk about AstroZeneca now, the drugs company that made one of the most widely shared, widely used COVID vaccines. And it has just told us that it is withdrawing its COVID-19 vaccine worldwide. And they say it's because a surplus of updated available vaccines is there. In other words, there's too many vaccines on the shelf. People aren't buying them. They don't want them. Commercially, it doesn't make sense. But I think it's worth also understanding a little bit of the background to this, because AstroZeneca stated in a High Court document filed just 2 months ago that it can, in very, very rare cases, cause TTS. Now, this is thrombosis with thrombocytopenia syndrome. It's a very rare syndrome that occurs when a person has blood clots together with a low platelet count. And I guess some people will hear what is happening today, the withdrawal of the vaccine from the market, and say that cannot surely not be related to what we now know about those side effects in very, very rare but devastating cases with some people who took it.
And of course, there has been so much toxicity and misinformation and disinformation surrounding vaccines and kind of COVID immunisation that, not surprisingly, there are those who are trying to find a causal link between the removal of AstraZeneca vaccines from the market and the fact that there have been these incredibly rare cases.
Yeah.
But of course, they are incredibly rare given the millions and millions of people who received doses of this when COVID arrived and the world was looking for a solution to this.
Yeah,
and it's easy to go down a rabbit hole and think, we were right all along. The vaccines were never safe. We should never have taken these vaccines.
I mean, their own estimates is that the vaccine saved between 6 and 7 million people worldwide. And they were looking at the beginning of efficacy of between 70 and 80%, right? Which is efficacy against getting COVID. I mean, to all intents and purposes, it outdid everyone's expectations of what the COVID vaccine could do. Don't forget, this was sort of, brought together in the space of months, whereas normally they take absolutely years to develop. And I think it's also important to say that AstraZeneca themselves are saying the withdrawal is unrelated to the vaccine's safety profile. But I guess the big picture is, even if you have a vaccine that is 99.5% foolproof, if you give that to a whole population of people, and in the UK you're talking more than 60 million, even that 0.5% will end up being a substantial number of people because it is so well rolled out. Now, I'm not saying that, it was all 99% of the UK that had it. Obviously, it wasn't children. Obviously, there were other vaccines at the same time. And you are left with about 80 or so of these cases, which I guess is devastating for the people concerned. These are blood clots, after all. They have had some life-changing, and in some cases, death. They have had some life-changing results, I think, in some cases, death. But in the scheme of things, when you're talking about the big number overall, it is a point of a percentage.
It is way, way less than 0.5%. I mean, way, way less. This is 99.999%. And it's that tiny fraction, which gives you a headline, 80 people affected, out of 60 million people, and again, I don't have the precise numbers, and I'm sure there are going to be vaccine skeptics who are going to go, well, no, you've misrepresented the numbers. But it is an infinitesimally small number, given the millions of people who you rightly point out that the government and governments around the world believe have literally been saved from death as a result of all of this.
Well, joining us now to talk us through it, really, is Adam Finn, who's Professor of Paediatrics at the University of Bristol and a former member of, and you'll remember this phrase from the sort of early 2020s, the JCVI, the Joint Committee on Vaccination Immunisation. And Adam, your task at that time, I guess, really was to kind of reassure everyone or to try and get us all to take the vaccination. So I'm just curious what your senses to the news that AstroZeneca has withdrawn its COVID vaccine. It says it was after a drop in demand. Does that all add up to you?
Yeah, I mean, there's a big surplus of COVID vaccines in general now, not just for them, but for all of the producers. I think the two manufacturers of the two big mRNA vaccines have also kind of overestimated demands, because just about everywhere now is only offering vaccines to the very elderly and high-risk people. So there's very little vaccine use going on than there was 2 or 3 years ago.
So it's nothing to do, because I think people will be confused by, the sort of peripheral memory of this court case that AstraZeneca has been fighting about the safety of the vaccine after a very, very small number of people, but with some devastating side effects, came forward to say that they had suffered after taking it. Are those two things unrelated?
Well, of course, I don't know that for a fact, but because I'm not, party to what AstraZeneca say and think, but my perception is that there really is no demand for this particular vaccine, which has not been upgraded to the newer variants, and it's much more difficult for them to do that than it is for the mRNA vaccines. So I do think it's likely to be because there really isn't a demand anymore for this, and it doesn't make commercial sense. But I don't really think they've got a market for it now.
But I'm sure an awful lot of people who, were anti-vax felt there were all sorts of things that were wrong about the rollout of vaccines, that there hadn't been the proper safety measures introduced and kept, who will be saying, I told you so. These vaccines were never safe.
Well, there's always a risk-benefit balance, John, in these things. And at the time, the benefits, the lives saved by this particular vaccine were vast. There were very, very large numbers of people's lives saved early on. And where we've seen vaccines in the past generate rare but severe side effects, that always becomes apparent, usually within a very short period of time, but after they've been rolled out and given to large numbers of people, because the size of the trials that you do before a vaccine is licensed are simply not large enough to pick up a signal that only occurs in 1 in 100,000 people. So, I mean, actually, the response to this side effect when it was first recognised in mid-2021 was pretty rapid, and we saw modification of the rollout. In fact, the vaccine wasn't really being used in this country by the end of that year. So I think at the time the side effect was recognised in a timely way, in the way that we normally do see with vaccines when there are problems.
Do you worry that one of the, I'm talking about side effects, will be that people will be more sceptical about MMR and other vaccines as well, where we are seeing a lower take-up now?
Yeah, that's a good question, John. I mean, I think COVID had some complicated effects on the public attitude towards vaccination, because I think it's widely recognised that they were in fact our salvation. They got us out of an incredible hole. And so I think there's a widespread appreciation of that fact. But I also think some people were scared about this, and some people were put off by conspiratorial stories that went around. I'm not sure that I would attribute the gradual, progressive and ongoing drop in coverage of other vaccines that we're seeing in the UK specifically to COVID, because that was going on already before COVID arrived. And I think it may be as much to do with the fact that we've been starving the health service of resources for a decade now, and our capacity to actually deliver vaccines has gone down.
Is that right? Really? I mean, are we actually not able to get the vaccines out to people now?
Well, the vaccines are there, they're being bought, they're being offered, but the truth is that to get yourself from the very, very high rates of coverage that we enjoy to the even higher rates of coverage that you need to stop, for example, infections like measles from circulating, you really do need to have nurses who can spend time chasing up the people who haven't arrived. The people who don't get immunised mostly are people who can't afford the bus fare or don't get their act together, and they need to be chased up and brought in. So when you've got a primary care system, as we have at the moment, that's on its knees, struggling just to sort of see people who are sick, you can easily see how that begins to become a problem.
Adam, it sounds like you're making a very clear differentiation between vaccine hesitancy, or, as you're saying, the inability to spare the time to get on the bus, and vaccine conspiracy of the kind that we see in sort of fringe groups or, dark web groups, or so prominently actually in the US. I mean, do you ever think we got proper anti-vax movements here? Was that ever something that you really feared, or was it just a sense of, we haven't got the time to spend on it, the education or sticking posters up here?
Well, I mean, I think vaccines enjoy majorities that politicians can only ever dream of, right? Just about everyone gets their kids immunised. Just about everyone who's offered a vaccine in a pandemic goes and gets vaccinated. There are, of course, a minority of people for different reasons who don't. But we don't. You're right that we don't have anything like the organised conspiracy theory-driven movement that exists in the States. I think one of the reasons for that is probably because vaccination in this country it's made available free at the point of receipt by the NHS. People trust the NHS, but nobody's obliged to be vaccinated. And if you remember, when the politicians decided to try and make the medical professionals get vaccinated compulsorily, that didn't last very long. So the attitude in this country is that people have vaccines because they want them. And I think that's part of the reason that we don't have this kind of conspiracy theory-driven movement that they do have as a problem in the US.
Sure, it's nothing like as bad as it is in the US, and that was absolutely plain. But there is still a significant anti-vax movement in the UK. Why do you think there is this greater hesitation than maybe there was a decade ago or 20 years ago? The theory around MMR, for example, the doctor who was behind that, who's been struck off, I think I'm right in saying.
Yeah, Andrew
Wakefield. But that hesitancy still persists around.
Yeah, I mean, actually, a long time ago, I was given an award by a society and gave a lecture on this, something like 2006. And I predicted that in the 21st century that we're now in, the main factor that would hold back prevention of disease by vaccines would not be lack of vaccines, as it was in the 20th century, but a reluctance to receive them. Vaccines are to some extent victims of their own success. So in the mid-20th century, when vaccines against whooping cough and polio arrived, parents queued up round the block to get their children immunised because they lived in fear of their children dying of these diseases. But once the diseases go away, of course, consciousness of the disease goes away, and there's a fertile ground for people to start imagining and sharing rumours and myths about the vaccines because they're not afraid of the disease anymore. And that's why we're seeing a return of vaccine-prevented diseases. We've got whooping cough problems now. There was a polio scare a couple of years ago in London, as you know. It didn't get beyond being detected in the sewage, but it was still a worry. We've got measles cases all over the place now. All the junior doctors that work for me don't recognise it because they've never seen it. I was seeing cases of measles in the 1980s, but it disappeared and now it's coming back. So that's a big part of the reason. And then the other thing that's happened, of course, as with so many of our problems these days, is we've now got these social media platforms which allow for this group polarization where people kind of get into a bubble where they're communicating with each other and confirming false ideas and not really engaging with mainstream information sources anymore. People who get their news from what used to be called Twitter can easily get misled. So I think that's part of it too.
Adam, you raised the question of vaccines being successful because here they're not compulsory. Would you have people working for you? You talked about your doctors, your staff. Would you have people working for you who chose not to immunise themselves, not to take vaccinations?
There were one or two, and the reason was that they had actually had COVID at that point. So that a lot of my colleagues very early on in 2020 were out on the front line and they ended up, despite their best efforts, getting COVID. And they really thought, well, I've had the disease now. Do I really need to have a vaccine?
What about other vaccines? I mean, is it something you check? I'm just sort of curious, actually. Is it something you would check when you employed somebody?
There are, in fact, compulsory vaccines. One of the things that we have to have in the medical profession is hepatitis B vaccine. It's a bloodborne infection, and it's an occupational requirement that you have it. We encourage staff to get influenza vaccine, but quite a few people don't. I actually think that quite a lot of doctors and nurses are quite needle phobic, funnily enough. They spend their life sticking needles into other people and they really don't like having them stuck into them.
It's like broadcasters hate microphones. You wouldn't believe it, but we do.
But yeah, I mean, most of my colleagues in the medical profession and in the nursing profession and other allied health professionals have actually been very enthusiastic about getting immunised against COVID because they didn't want to get sick and they didn't want to infect their patients. So on the whole, there's been very high uptake.
Adam, thank you so much. That was really great
Really
explanation of what's going on. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.
Nice talking to you. Take care.
Before we go, just can I tell you about Newsagents USA this week, because we're going to talk quite a lot about black silk pyjamas, the missionary position.
When don't we?
I mean, when don't we? Rolled up magazines and thwacking the former president on the bottom.
The Victoria Wood moment. That's all that I can think about when I hear about somebody being thwacked on the backside with a magazine.
We're talking Stormy Daniels in court, under oath, and talking about when she was under Donald Trump as well. And it has been quite a salacious, extraordinary moment in a court case that has kind of, as you can imagine, transfixed America, transfixed the world. It's a kind of interesting question as well about what impact this has on the trial and whether it helps the prosecution's case or harms it.
So just to give you the background on that, Stormy Daniels was the sex worker, but she was also a director of porn films. She had an encounter with Donald Trump in 2006, which she has described in court with so much detail about the bathroom floors in the hotel room where they met, about the bed, about what he was wearing, about what she was wearing, about the mahogany furniture. There is an extraordinary level of detail about the encounter. And what she has basically explained to us is that at Lake Tahoe in Nevada, during a sort of golfing tournament, Trump asked to have dinner with her. His kind of coterie said, "Oh, go ahead, why don't you? You'll get a good story out of it." Famous last words. And having returned from the loo into the bedroom, she found him sitting on the bed waiting to have sex with her, and there was a man, bodyguard outside the door. Now, none of this, we should repeat 17,000 times, is illegal. This is not what the trial is about.
And Donald Trump, we should also add, denies that this encounter took place. He denies he had sex with her.
So it is, if it happened, completely legitimate. You are allowed, under state law in Nevada, you are allowed to have sex with a sex worker. What became clear from her testimony was that Donald Trump never minded if his wife Melania knew about this. That wasn't ever something that had come up. There was no kind of don't keep it secret. He explained that they had separate bedrooms, that she understood. It wasn't that kind of, presumably that kind of marriage. But years later, she was approached by one of his henchmen in a car park. This is her claim. And she was told to shut up, that she could not speak about it because it was the eve of the 2016 election. And she then got given $130,000 of hush money. And it is that exchange that is really before the judge and the jury this time around, because the prosecution allege that that money came from campaign funds to shut her up, to make it easier for him to go on and win the 2016 election. And it was money unaccounted for, and it was money that he denies ever having paid.
But we know he had paid it because we saw the cheques reproduced that Donald Trump had signed to pay Stormy Daniels off to keep her quiet before the election. So it wasn't just a personal matter involving Melania. It was about not damaging his own election campaign. There is so much more to say about this, and that is all on the Newsagents USA.
Bye for now.
Bye-bye.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.